Hello, this is Anna Laura Brown, host of the Autoimmune Rehab Podcast, where we talk about how to actually thrive and heal your autoimmune condition rather than just covering it up with pills or changing your diet and hoping you'll feel better one day. We feature solo episodes on helpful topics and interviews with guests who have actually walked in your shoes with autoimmune disorders and or who have years of experience in helping people to thrive and not just survive with autoimmune challenges. I'm a health coach who started this podcast because I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's in 2018 and wanted to inspire hope and transform health for people with autoimmune challenges. So keep listening and let's get you the help and hope you really need. This is the Autoimmune Rehab Podcast. And today I'm really happy to welcome Claire Ketchum to the podcast. And Claire and I are going to have a conversation about a topic that we haven't had the opportunity to discuss yet, but should be a really good one. So we're going to be talking about some things today like some of the differences between type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune condition, and type 2, which is not, as well as some of the challenges around blood sugar and how to make diet changes and some other different related topics when it comes to autoimmunity, that kind of thing. So, welcome, Claire. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. Sure. So my name, as was just said, my name is Claire Ketchum, and I teach yo-yo dieters how to make sustainable progress towards their feel-good weight. But that is not where I started. For sure. When I started was just with mindful eating, and that was working really well for me. I was really happy with me. I had given up restrictive dieting and I was just eating mindfully and everything was going really, really well. And then my daughter was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and everything, just my whole life just changed in an instant, like just from that day of that diagnosis. And that is sort of what's got me on this journey, because all of a sudden mindful eating just didn't work anymore. It was like, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't focus on it. I couldn't focus on anything. And so that is what got me into doing what I do. And so a little bit, usually I talk more about the yo-yo dieting, but today we're going to talk more about, sort of what I learned along the way and what I changed in my lifestyle habits while helping my daughter we all figured out how to manage type 1 diabetes, because it is definitely a family event for sure.
Oh, absolutely. That's a good point. And and I've talked about mindful eating before and things like that. And mindful eating's great, except for when you have something like a type 1 diabetes, or I would argue even things like celiac disease, things like that, where it's like, well, your mindset might be saying, hey, I want this, but your body already knows intuitively that you actually can't have that. So, that can
Yeah.
definitely present a challenge. So, what do
Yeah.
you feel like the first, I don't know, maybe I don't say the first thing you did, but maybe, what were some of the first things you did after she got her diagnosis that you felt like were a good thing that you did to help her manage it and then help, like you say, the whole family manage it too?
Well, the first thing we did is well, the number one thing I did is I got a food scale, which is the opposite of mindful eating. And I weighed out everything that she was eating so that I could count her carbs as closely as possible. And because I had never done a diet that counted carbs before, so I really didn't know how to do it. And so to leave the hospital and say, like, you have to count carbs so that you're giving the right amount of insulin, that was all brand new to me. I had no idea how to do it. And so getting a scale so I could just weigh it out, there's just sitting there like counting out goldfish for her or counting out grapes. Like that was really, really helpful when we first were diagnosed. Now she's on, but when you're first diagnosed, you have to be on shots. They won't, and now she's on a pump. And so with shots, you can only get 1 or 2 units of insulin. And then with a pen, you can get like 1.2, 1.3, like you can get like smaller doses. And with a pump, you can really fine tune how much insulin you're getting. So it gets easier the more advanced you get. But when you come out of the hospital, at least maybe now it's different, but that, because it was 10 years ago, you had to do very, very sort of broad ranges of insulin. So you had to really be careful that you weren't giving her too much. And so that was one thing that we did right away. And that changed how we all ate, because when you really see how much a serving is, you're like, wow, that's really very much food. And then you're like, okay, well, a serving is this much sugar. And, when I have a bowl of cereal, I'm probably having three and a half servings. So I think I'm only having this, but I'm really having a lot more. So it was really eye-opening as a whole family. I would say my son was less. I mean, nobody was thrilled, but I also felt like as a family, we needed to all make these changes. It couldn't just be her making the changes. So I also made my son eat a serving of cereal when he ate cereal. Like we all did it to make her feel less alone. And in this whole diagnosis, for sure, that's one thing that we did.
That's a good point. And the thing is, I think, like has been said, I mean, if you pay any attention to health headlines in the news or anything, you know that diabetes and blood sugar issues, pre-diabetes has become epidemic, not just in the US, but around the world. And measuring knowing how much food you're actually eating is a big part of weight loss and controlling things like your insulin resistance and things like that. And I think you make a good point there. A lot of us eat way more food than what we're actually are realizing or acknowledging. We think, oh, we're not really eating that much. This is only one serving. But then when you actually take the time to look at how much food it is, you weigh it if necessary, or check the
Yeah.
actual packaging serving size. We're actually consuming way more food than we realize. So yeah, that's a good point for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And it does, and the thing is when, you don't have to measure forever because you do get better. You're like, okay, well, this is the bowl that I use. And I know that this is about 30 carbs when I pour it in here. This is about a serving. So it's not like you're not like chained to that for the rest of your life, but it's really good. When you are starting out learning how to count carbs, or, if you feel like, wow, I just feel like I'm gaining weight and I don't really know why, going back to like being honest about how much you're eating can be really helpful because oftentimes we're just like, we take a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, or, as we age, what we need changes, just like when she was diagnosed, she was 9, now she's 22. So, she doesn't need as much food at 22. And when she was 9, I mean, she ate constantly because she was growing so much. And, she had basically, been in a diabetic high for 3 or 4 months when she was diagnosed, which meant, so when you're in a diabetic high, you're not getting any nutrients. So she was literally starving herself to death for 3 to 4 months. And so upon that diagnosis, she was like eating like crazy, to try to like feed her body again. Now that she was getting insulin to actually like be able to access it again. So that is just really helpful for really anybody along the way, no matter what you're doing, is to just really be, come back to it every once in a while. Don't consider it a life sentence to be doing that. It can help reframe
sure.
it and make it less like daunting or
So
horrible.
along with that, what other kinds of changes did you make to her diet other than obviously weighing the food and determining, how much food you were actually eating? What other kinds of changes did you make?
Well, at the very beginning, we made changes in the sense of like, we tried to have her snacks be as low carb as possible because it's sort of that law of small numbers. So if you're eating lower carbs, you're taking less insulin and there's less chance for you getting those numbers wrong. And so that is really helpful across the board. But, things like, pancake. We used to always eat like pancakes every weekend, or waffles or something like that. That's what we ate on Sundays together as a family. And, 4 pancakes and just 4 tablespoons of syrup is like 100 carbs. And it was just a lot of sugar for her body to take on at once. And so we slowly just stopped doing that as a family. And so it was a nice family time, and now it's like, I can't even remember the last time we've eaten pancakes. Like, it's just not even a part of our life anymore. But that felt sad at first. And now it's like, it doesn't matter. So that was definitely a change that we made. I was really against diet soda in general because it's not great for you, but really for her, it was better because it didn't spike her blood sugar. So that was something that I had to shift. She was happy with it. She liked diet soda. Definitely changed my mindset around juice. Juices should never be consumed unless you're in a diabetic low. As far as I'm concerned, there's just no use for it. Unless, you're using it as I'm like, oh, I love juice and this is a really big treat for me. and I'm just really enjoying it. Like that was a mindset shift that my whole family made around juice. And then as she got onto a pump and we didn't have to be so cautious about her, how much insulin she was getting, you can sort of loosen the reins on that, because really, like, what a type 1 diabetic should and should not be eating is really the same as anybody else, as far as, having good insulin control, having good blood sugar control and not becoming insulin resistant. So, not eating too many carbs at once, so your blood sugar stays steady, like having fat and protein, like all of that stuff is good for everybody. So those were all things that you become more aware of how important it is to have that combination of those macronutrients in every single thing that you eat in order to keep your blood sugar stable.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point because, like you said, I mean, the pancakes and the maple syrup, that's a lot of carbs. I mean, that's not good really for anybody. And juice is a whole, oh boy, we could go down a rabbit hole there, but there was
Oh
an
my gosh,
interview
I
that
know.
I published.
I get irrational about juice. I have to
There was
tell
an
you.
interview I posted with somebody else a couple weeks ago that the lady was having chronic pain for a long, long time and discovered that drinking too much juice was actually part of that. And there's a
Really?
whole thing with, juice. People think juice is healthy. It's actually not. But,
I know. It's a real big misconception. And I think we've come a long way. Like since when my children were little, I can remember giving my son those sippy cups, and I think there were 24 ounces of juice in it, and he was 5, and that's what I gave him to get him out of bed for kindergarten. I like cringe when I think about that. I did that as a mom. Like, it's so horrible. Like, what a horrible way to start your day. He loved it, of course, but yeah, but that's definitely one of the biggest changes that we saw with her, is that, anything that's just pure sugar, it just spiked. And another thing that we definitely changed was the conception of like whole wheat bread is so much better than white bread, or white bread is, white rice is, you should always eat brown. And we didn't really see a huge difference in her blood sugar when she ate one or the other. Like the amount of insulin she needed for one or the other was basically the same. And so I look, if you really like white bread a lot better than whole wheat, unless it's like a hearty, like really good, solid, like great bread, like just a generic, everyday wheat bread is not that much better for you than a white bread. So I stopped forcing that, as a person who is sort of becoming a health coach and getting, into all of this. I just said, if you like white bread better, eat white bread, it's fine.
yeah, and there is, I think, again, that is another misconception, around just the carbs are carbs, really, at the end of the day, whether it's what the
Yeah, because
source
people are like,
is.
oh, she can't eat sugar. I was like, no, she can eat sugar in the same way that you can eat sugar. And she shouldn't eat sugar in the same way that you shouldn't eat sugar. The only thing that's different for her is that her body doesn't give her insulin. She has to give it to herself. And, when you inject insulin, it takes 20 minutes for that insulin to absorb. So it does, if she's going to eat something that has a ton of sugar in it, like pancakes and syrup, she should really take her insulin 20 minutes before she eats it and start to see that number coming down. So that when she eats it, because she's going to spike, like no matter what, her insulin, her blood sugar is going to spike when she eats something like that. So if she can get herself lower, then she's going to, then the spike doesn't bring her as high. But that's the difference between type 1 and type 2. Like there's, you're going to have highs and lows when you're very first diagnosed. You have what they call the honeymoon period. It's kind of like, for people who are mothers, like it's kind of like having the first child. Like you don't know how easy it was until you have 2, and then you're like, why did I think 1 was so hard? Because it's so much harder having a baby and a toddler. So when you're first diagnosed, you still have a little bit of your body is still making a little bit of insulin. So you don't have those as big highs, lows, because your body will still give you a little bit of insulin. And then my daughter lasted about 9 months in the honeymoon period, and then she was totally out and she didn't have any insulin anymore. And then that's when you see like, oh yeah, her blood sugar is 350. Like that just happens. Like that's just part of being a type 1 diabetic. And, sometimes it means that her insulin site, is bad or clogged or pulled out a little bit, or she just didn't, she didn't count her carbs closely enough, or she's stressed out, or, whatever. Like there's so many reasons, so many things that impact your blood sugar. And you can't account for all of them. And so you just have to do your best. Whereas, with a type 2 diabetic, they still have insulin, they still make insulin, they just don't access it as well. So, changing their diet makes a much bigger difference in their ability to control those highs and lows, where a type 1 diabetic really just has to do the best they can to manage like all of these variables. And then if they don't get it right, then they just give themselves more insulin through their pump and move on with their day. That's kind of what they do.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know I realized when I first started getting into studying health and nutrition, I don't think I really realized to the extent that blood sugar levels change over time in all of us, not just diabetics, and that the food that we eat has an impact on those blood sugar levels. And you would think that might be something obvious that a lot of us should be aware of, but I don't think it was something that I was really fully aware of till probably a few years ago when I started learning more about it, and I was like, "Oh," you know?
Exactly. Well, I knew nothing. I didn't know anything about blood sugar until my daughter was diagnosed with diabetes. I mean, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know how to count carbs. I didn't really know, how important it was to have, fat and protein and a complex carbohydrate. Like I didn't understand that, like why that was important. But now that, once you know something, you can't unknow it, right? And so then it's like, I'll eat something like jelly beans, which is, which is perfect if you're in a diabetic low, like it's the best thing for you. But like, I'll feel like the head rush and feel like a little bit, but like I feel the blood sugar, like, because I know what I'm doing to myself, because I can see, because my daughter is on a constant glucose monitor. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's just, it's something that, she attaches to her skin, and it gives her a reading every 5 seconds. So she can know where her blood sugar is, and it will tell her if her blood sugar is going up or down, or if it's stable, and it will tell her actually how quickly it's going up and down, depending on how the arrow is pointing. So you can see in real time what's happening to her when she eats something like that. So if it's happening to her, it's happening to everybody. Like it's obviously not going to be as dramatic. Like as a person who has, isn't insulin resistant and has good blood sugar control in general, like your blood sugar is not going to go up to 300 because you're eating jelly beans, but it's probably going to spike over 100, which isn't great for you,
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I've seen another trend the last few years of some, health gurus or other people, getting those and trying them out for, a few months, even if they don't have diabetes, just to monitor it and be more aware of what's going on. And so, I mean, that's not something I've done, but that's, if you're worried about your blood sugar levels or your weight or that kind of thing, I mean, that could be an option to potentially try one for a little bit and actually monitor and say, hey, look what's going on in me.
Yes. And it's actually there's a lot more companies that do them now. And it's still expensive. Like my daughter's Dexcom is, I think it's almost $10,000. Like it's a lot. But they just came out with a version that the transmitter and the sensor is its own unit, and it just connects to your phone. So you don't need everything that came along with it originally, which, when she first went on it. So they've made it smaller and smaller and more for, I'm sure it's still expensive. I don't know how much it costs for a regular person without diabetes to get it. But yeah, it's so interesting. But the caveat to that I did hear is that sometimes people who don't really get it, they'll get them and they're so concerned about their blood sugar spiking that they'll start to not eat any carbs at all, because really your blood sugar is always going to spike. It's always going to spike a little bit when you eat. Like that's just part of how the body, like what happens, right? It's like your insulin doesn't take that sugar out of your blood like instantly. So people can get a little obsessive about it. So that was the one person I never thought of anything that bad could happen about managing your, like seeing it, right? Getting the information. But if you get too obsessive about it, as a not a type 1 diabetic.
Yeah, I can
But
see that being an issue for sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's
yeah.
talk a little bit about how do you feel like what kinds of things can people do to make sustainable changes to their diet for the long term if I mean they have a reason whether it's actually a diabetes reason or let's say it's celiac disease or Hashimoto's or another autoimmune condition or maybe try to lose weight or they've got some sustainable or valid reason why they need to make changes to their diet, but yet, sometimes they struggle a little bit. What would you say would be some good ways to make that happen?
Well, I think the easiest, so when I talk about making like sustainable changes, people who are trying to make something like say they're, I mean, there's lots of different reasons why you want to change your diet. So if we're using type 1 diabetes as an example, let's say, okay, I want to make sure that every time I'm eating, I'm, eating as close to balanced macros as possible. Like that's your goal. Then you might start to feel resentful that you always have to be thinking about it and nobody else does. And so that can get you into a negative mindset, which increases your stress, right? Because you're like sort of maybe angry or annoyed. And anytime you have sort of a negative emotion, it's going to activate that stress response. And what happens is if we are resentful of what we're doing, or it could be anything, right? It could be you could have that could just be one example, but it could be like maybe you had a stressful conversation, maybe you have something going on at work, maybe you got laid off, maybe you're, having problems in your marriage. Like any kind of stress can activate what I call the chronic stress loop. And then you rely on your default habit to reduce that stress. So if your default habit happens to be eating food to soothe stress, then you're going to have these sabotaging thoughts that are going to drive you to that behavior. And so that could be like, oh, just a little won't hurt, or I'll be good again tomorrow, or it won't spike my blood sugar that badly. Or maybe you get stomach aches, like, oh, I probably won't, this probably won't hurt my stomach that much. Or like you start justifying why you don't have to do it. And so what I teach my clients is that you want to have a 3-prong approach. So you want to have strategies that keep you stressed, that make you stress resilient. So things that you can do throughout the day that generally keep your stress low so that when something happens, you have the ability to respond to it without your go-to habit of eating food. And then the second thing that you can do is sort of create habits. And so we've talked a little bit about that already about sort of just things that you can do with food to create habits, but things like, sitting when you're eating and chewing your food, or, taking deep breaths before you eat food, anything like that sort of calms the nervous system. And so you're replacing that automatic habit of eating food with sort of being more mindful about it. And then the third thing that you could do is sort of identify those sabotaging thoughts that you have and start to work on reprogramming them so that the thoughts that you're having are actually supporting you and keeping you on track with your goals. So if your thought is like, everybody else is having it, why do I have to be the only one who has whatever disease you have, right? You could reframe that, be like, I have a choice. I can either eat this and feel badly, or I can, not eat it and feel fine. So it gives you sort of that power. It helps you reframe that thought in a more positive way and making you feel like less of a victim and more empowered. Like I have the ability to make this choice. So it's all about making you feel more calm and centered and embodied as you make your choices that are going to make you feel your best.
That's awesome. I love that. Yeah, and I think the whole concept of reframing their whole mindset, that applies to any aspect of any kind of autoimmune or health journey whatsoever, whether you're dealing with food changes or other kinds of lifestyle changes. You just have to make those changes to your mindset in order to really heal yourself. That's just how it goes, it's
Yeah,
important.
right. Because if you don't change your mindset, then you're just going every time you get stuck in that chronic stress loop, they're just going to come back. And I can't remember I think it's like 80,000 thoughts a day or something. And most of them are negative and most of them are the same we had yesterday. So it's, it's not like our subconscious mind is like, yeah, this is how we feel. And so until you shift it, you're just going to keep on having the same experience over and over again. And then you'll feel like, well, I'm a failure and it's my fault. Well, it's not your fault. it's just that you haven't sort of learned learn that it's really the stress that is activating you to make these decisions. And so if you can sort of figure out ways to be more stress resilient throughout the day, so as I said before, you'll have a better ability to stick with those habits that you want to do, that are going to make you feel better.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, this has been a great conversation. Hopefully everybody's found this helpful. So Claire, what would be the best way for people to connect with you if they want to learn more about you and how they can get in touch?
Well, the best way to get in touch with me is I'm on Instagram. I'm at claireketchum.ck, or you can go to my website, which is claireketchum.com. And so either one of those would be great.
Awesome. Okay, well, we will have those linked below. And is there anything else you wanted to share that we didn't get around to talking about?
No, I think that is generally the advice I give, no matter what you're going through, is to take time to figure out what those three things, what reducing stress, spotting those sabotaging thoughts and reprogramming them, and working on changing your default habit. That those three combined are really going to make a difference in helping you stick with your goals. For sure.
Awesome. That's great. So yeah, thanks for coming on again then. And those of you that are listening, if you would do us all a favor and rate this podcast, consider writing a review, share it with anybody else that you feel like can be beneficial, and reach out to Claire. If you are interested in talking with her, that would be great. And thanks for coming on, Claire, and thanks for listening, everybody.